So, welcome, folks, to a special edition of the America's Future Series Space Talks with Z. I'm Z. How are you doing? And thank you for joining us today. And thank you very much to all our sponsors who make this series possible. Today, we're joined by Michael Sheetz, space reporter at CNBC. Now, that is a cool title, right? How many people in history have been called a space reporter? Michael came to us as a colleague. He has in the past been editor in chief of the Empire State Tribune and covered a variety of different topics. Thank you, Michael, very much for joining us. It's truly an honor to have you here and being one of the pioneers in your perhaps not profession, but certainly specialism in that profession. Can you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and, as a journalist, what drew you to reporting on space?
Well, Z, thank you first of all for having me on. I really appreciate the time and featuring a reporter, someone who, like yourself, gets to ask people great questions all day and learn all sorts of things about topics and something like the space industry, which has just an infinite volume of amount of information and new knowledge that's always being gathered every day. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about something that's very close to both of our hearts and our careers. So, but I'd say, first of all, I really got into the reporting on space on accident, as I feel like many journalists do in any part of their careers when they're covering a beat or what we describe as a topic area. We fall into it just by kind of pulling on the natural threads of journalistic curiosity. And for me, it happened a few years ago. I was on CNBC's breaking news team, and there was a milestone SpaceX launch that was happening over the weekend. And my editor asked for someone to just work a couple extra hours over the weekend and, cover this launch because, as now SpaceX has done many times since then, they've set milestones again and again in different parts of the industry. But they, I just thought, hey, this sounds interesting. Don't know a lot about SpaceX, don't know a lot about space. But as a reporter, it's really fascinating to see that this is a part of the U.S. economy where private companies are having success. And so I covered it. It was pretty just simple event. And then I just kept pulling on the threads of, okay, how do you make money in space? Why would private ventures be interested in putting, money in space? I, like many people, thought that space was really a domain that was only for governments and only for experimental projects and things of that nature. So I didn't never think of it as something that what you would imagine as a large U.S. company to be solely focused on. And so, to my surprise, I discovered that SpaceX actually wasn't alone. That there was this growing ecosystem of companies all across the United States in many different approaches, mentalities. You have everything from the companies that have been founded and built up by billionaires to just some really scrappy, incredible entrepreneurs who are winning contracts and providing services for a variety of commercial customers. And so that, I think, was the really interesting thing for me to begin exploring. And as a huge credit to my editors at CNBC, they never dampened my enthusiasm for chasing this down. I was on our markets team for quite a bit of time and covered just, stocks, bonds, equities, right? And so I was doing my space reporting kind of on the side in my spare time. And it just kept growing and growing and growing until we kind of reached this critical mass point, and my editors eventually approached me with, hey, do you want to do this full time? We'll set you on the space beat. This will be what you do 24/7, because we really think there's an audience here, especially an audience to really learn more about space from the business and investing standpoint, because there are other space reporters. I'm honored to be, not not even close to the first in terms of colleagues that, I mean, great reporters who have come before that have covered the space industry and the achievements of the U.S. space program in the past. But I really, have been focused on the business and investing aspect of how do people make money in space and why would they want to, and who are those people? So that's been my journey so far, and it's been a thrilling one. It's taken me all over the country and even to now different parts of the world, and maybe it'll one day take me to space.
See, now that's a cool thought. Is in terms of your paths to space, journalism is certainly a very interesting one. But this is really, it brings kind of an interesting question to mind. You covered a lot of ground there, in terms of the bigs, as many of us in the industry call them, meaning that we had the traditional bigs, which was the Lockheeds, the Boeings, Raytheons, Northrops, etc., the usual suspects of aerospace and defense. And now you have kind of a set of new bigs, in terms of course, led by SpaceX, followed closely by Blue Origin and Virgin Orbit and Galactic. Virgin has two lobes. It's quite remarkable. And then you've got kind of, I think of Rocket Lab as a first tier. And then you've kind of got the second tier guys who are getting there, maybe a couple of test launches. And then you've got the third tier folks who are there doing innovation. On America's Future Series, we had hosted Tim Ellis of Relativity, and you, of course, covered that massive round that they recently acquired of funding. So, how do you approach chronicling the modern space race? There is so much happening all over the world. What is your approach to being a chronicler, right? A watcher and a reporter of this amazing time we're living in?
Yeah, I think I really like the use of the word chronicler. I think that's actually quite helpful for understanding what a reporter does and what my job generally looks like on a day-to-day basis. Because I feel like it's sometimes difficult to understand what the media's role is in any industry and in any sector of life. And I think, especially with the space industry, I mean, we have loads of people, who are engineers and scientists who are focused on that on their day job. And I don't blame them at all for maybe not understanding, why a reporter would, want to find out information and want to, keep up to date on program success and or failures, right? So I'll step back a little bit here, and I'll say that first and foremost, my job as a reporter, it has been always to find out what the facts of record are. The phrase, being on the record is an indication to show people that this is something that is going to be attributed to a person who represents an organization and who said a specific thing that I am, entering into essentially the public record. And so that's the bread and butter of what I do, is simply just try to find out, information, cite it accurately, and deliver it to people, whether it's through publishing articles or even just, I really started to try to use social media as a way to provide updates on a lot of the companies and different people that I report on, mostly because sometimes there's smaller updates that are great little bite-sized pieces for social media, but maybe aren't, worth a full article for CNBC. But it helps people who really want to keep up with the industry and want to keep up with what else is happening, whether it's a competitor or a partner, or even just, some people who are space enthusiasts. You can do a lot there. And so that's been a lot of what I do as a reporter. So again, I really like the use of the word chronicler, because that, I think, is a pretty specific and apt description of what I feel like my job is. I sometimes people maybe have misconceptions about what a reporter does, but I actually clarified this point recently to someone. I pointed out that, I am a reporter. I'm telling you, hey, here's what, happened here's who said something, right? I'm not a columnist or, an op-ed contributor, for example, who who are published by different media organizations. But unlike me, those people have their opinion and their view entered into the fact of record, basically. And so that's something I try to work really hard at, is to make sure that my opinion and my view is not being entered into the fact of record, but merely stating the case of what's happening and what people ought to know, and why it matters.
So that's really interesting, as to the methodology. Now, of that chronicle and those facts, where do you feel you're finding your discussion is resonating, or has the greatest audience? You mentioned that you focus on the business and commercial applications as opposed to the defense, for example. However, right, those two are not mutually exclusive anymore. SpaceX is commercial, but it's commercial in that it is a commercial launch company as opposed to NASA doing the launches. But its customer has primarily been defense until now, and to this day, in my understanding, much to the chagrin of some friends of mine whose satellites have been bumped from the payload registry. The Air Force, in its contracts, requires that their payloads get top priority on a rocket. So I'm just curious as to how you see where your audience is, where you feel your audience is, and how you see that breakdown and intermixing happening in terms of who's listening, who's interested, and what aspect they're interested in.
Audience is actually a really fantastic question, because so much of what I do, I've had feedback from people in the industry, and I'll give an example of a couple different cases where people say, oh, you focused on how much the stock moves too much, or you focused on the size of the company rather than trying to do diligence on the technical aspects of the hardware. And all those things are good and important, but the thing that I always try to keep in mind, and I'm often reminded by my editors, is that I'm writing first and foremost for CNBC's audience of everything from consumers to investors. And you're talking about, the titans of Wall Street all the way down to, people shopping at Target, right? And so that's kind of the way I try to think of it, is I want to be, smart enough in terms of the way I write and how I report, that the smartest minds of business and the most shrewd investors would read a story and say, yes, I learned something from that. Well, that was interesting. Tell me more, right? All the way down to, taking a story and having, my mother read it, who's a, physical therapist, right? And have her say, I understood this. This makes a lot of sense. I'm, curious to learn more and ask questions about it. And not, if I have to explain a story on the side of what I actually wrote, then I realized that I didn't do a good enough job of making this easy to understand and clear, So, and that's a basic premise as a communicator. So that's one thing I'm really cognizant of, is my audience is CNBC's audience first and foremost. I'd say secondarily, I've been very surprised by how wide the space industry is being recognized within other industries and within other ecosystems. And I'll say this is from very much a U.S. perspective. So I don't know if this holds true internationally or not. But I will say that I am continually very fascinated by how many people, from family funds to hedge funds to private equity on the investor side, are poking around the space industry and are always kind of curious to learn more, even if they don't have any skin in the game necessarily. But then also in other various industries where there's these fascinating overlaps. And I'll give it a quite recent example of every time that the SpaceX flies cargo missions to the International Space Station, I'm reminded of all the other industries, whether it's pharmaceuticals, agricultural technologies that are in the development, all these other kind of sub industries in terms of what the space industry does, that are all very interested in the health of the industry and what new technologies are coming about and who's developing, cheaper rockets and, more modular spacecraft and more powerful, energy sources in orbit. So that, I think that's one thing that's always been, I've been surprised by in my reporting, is how far the space industry reaches in terms of people paying attention to it and wanting to learn more about it, because they see how it's beginning to affect them on a daily basis and in their daily lives, even if they don't realize before that the only reason their smartphone can tell them where their Uber is because of satellite. So that I think is something that is continually reaching out, and it's been amazing to be kind of right on the leading edge there as a reporter.
That's it's quite a privilege, I imagine, in some ways, to be there, and just to follow up, you mentioned that some people reach out to you that saying that you're focused too much on this aspect or too much on that aspect. How do you, from that, are there any special nuggets or particular experiences that you've had, where you're like, wow, this person is paying attention to this story, or from so and so industry, or even so and so or some particular individual that might have reached out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to give any specific names, just because off the top of my head, I can't remember, what things people might have said to me, just kind of off the record, feedback. But I will say it's been pleasantly surprising anytime that someone is willing to either give pushback or even just any kind of feedback on my reporting, and I welcome it so much, because a reporter is only as good as the information that they are being given and the information that they can discover. And so I am so willing to just, go the extra mile to try to make sure that I'm, really telling the full story and not missing out on pieces or misstating things or mischaracterizing something. And so that makes listening to feedback critical. And so I tell people very often, and some of my favorite sources of information are not necessarily people that you'll see me quoting in articles very often, but these are sources who are consistently reaching out to me and saying, hey, I saw this in your story, you might want to consider this. Here's, an aspect of that business that is valuable in a way that, maybe you didn't recognize, or even just having questions about it. I get questions on stories, especially because I'll often write an exclusive. You mentioned the relativity announcement recently, right? And so, I've had a couple questions on that one, for example, because, people are curious to learn more about a company that's raising tremendous amounts of firepower in terms of capital and has a technology that could have implications much more broadly beyond just, building rockets. And so, as you can imagine, that drives a lot of conversation and a lot of questions of, is this really a rocket company or is this a 3D printing company, right? And so people trying to sort that out is really fascinating. And so, just to kind of sum things all up, as a reporter, just feedback is invaluable. And I get emails every day from people, because I try to make myself as accessible as I can. And you get everything from people who really, really think you messed something up and write all caps angry emails into your inbox, to very thoughtful texts and calls and oftentimes things that make me realize ways I can improve my reporting going forward. So I try to look at being a reporter as a constant learning experience, where you are always trying to gather the entire picture.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So, switching gears just a little bit, I want to ask you about a little more detailed question. What about the fact that things are almost getting routine in some areas with space really excites you. And where do you, from your perspective, where can that be really powerful? Because some things are getting routine almost. It's kind of amazing.
Sorry, I think you might have cut out there briefly. Would you mind restating the question?
Uh, what what excites you about what is
Mm.
becoming regular about space? Whether it's the fact that we can kind of do launches at will, or other things for that matter. Um, it's kind of remarkable that
I,
things are pretty routine in some ways.
that is a great question because I think what excites me is might surprise some people. Maybe not for people who know the industry really well. But I think the thing that's most exciting to me is any type of manufacturing, and I'll just say more broadly, operations in space. And I'm not talking about exploration missions. Those are incredible to see. I mean, we've had some really milestone missions, both launch, uh, perform operations, and even return. But anything that has a significant implication on the way that we can either robotically or through human control manufacture and operate in space is, I think, the most exciting application of in terms of how the industry can then benefit life on Earth in the long run. Because I think that's one of the main goals, especially if anything, is that the point of creating wealth and the point of building these successful businesses is so that humanity is better off for it. And so one thing I'll highlight was earlier this year was that the Northrop Grumman MEV-1 satellite refueling mission. That mission was incredible for being able to demonstrate that that servicing a satellite that still had life in it, essentially, right? But in terms of what we think of as something that's maybe more relatable to people, like replacing the batteries in a remote control, right? The remote control might be old, but you can still use it if it's got fresh batteries. And so that mission showing that you could send a spacecraft to a satellite, service it, bring it back into operations, and then be able to move on and then do that for more satellites in the same mission cycle. That is incredible technology. And I think there's other, different companies. I'll call out, Made in Space has been doing some pretty amazing work in terms of actually manufacturing in microgravity in orbit, and anything in that realm. When you're talking about doing private space stations where you can expand the depths of research we're already doing on the International Space Station to just any kind of spacecraft, debris collection. All of those are probably the most exciting missions for me. The thing that captures the human imagination, and I'll say more broadly about the industry, is and it has been and probably will always be human spaceflight. So any kind of flying astronauts to space is incredible and is an achievement, like with that SpaceX had earlier this year with flying NASA astronauts for the first time. That should be celebrated, and we get excited because that we can connect with it as human beings so well, and we can kind of almost see ourselves in those astronauts and see ourselves flying in that capsule. And so I think that it's never going to be necessarily the most valuable piece of the space economy. I mean, you look at any economy, and human transportation is not the most valuable piece of that economy. Moving cargo, moving information is. And so that's where I think that's what gets me excited, is about, kind of expanding the possibilities of any type of manufacturing and operations that we can do.
Wow. So and that is really exciting. One of the things that I know I was pinged on a few years ago, because I used to do some crystal growing of all things, was what type of crystals require gravity to grow, and what type of crystals, if we didn't have gravity, could we grow? And so that's something that I've thought about over the years. It's a little different from manufacturing, but it's still in line with the concept of making things in and for space, but really taking advantage of the lack of specific space attributes. Maybe there's a business there. I don't know. Um, but you know that's so it's interesting because it's very pragmatic on one side, but it's also fascinating and innovative on the other. So you know, thank you for that perspective, Michael. Switching gears again a little bit, one thing that, as a journalist, you might be able to help our audience with is putting this era into context as compared to the 60s and 70s. And I'm curious as to your thoughts as to whether or not how this compares to the kind of Cold War defense-focused efforts of the 60s and 70s versus what the effect versus possibly how this we might find a closer analog to the era between World War I and World War II, where we had Howard Hughes and those types of folks driving an aviation race of sorts, and pioneers like Lindbergh and Earhart, for example. What are your thoughts on kind of the historical analogs that might come to mind, and of course the differences between those historical analogs?
Well, I appreciate your willingness to extend to me, you know, a reporter who has been so focused on the current era that I'll say that just as a caveat that there are historians and you know, especially people who are space historians who have a great and improved understanding of the Cold War and Apollo era than I do as a reporter, you know, covering this now in the 21st century. But in the limited, you know, comparison that I've been able to draw, I'd say that the biggest difference I've seen is the difference in terms of what we understand space to be as far as an industry goes. And so when you think about creating marketplaces in any industry, it's about what are the incentives there, right? And so when you look at the difference, I'll shout out between today's growth and what the boom and the accomplishments of the Apollo era, or why they were being, you know, what was driving them. And I'd say that the biggest incentive difference here is, and then, you know, you have a Cold War, and you also have the greater fears of kind of falling behind in terms of technological prowess, and the government being the main incentive driver for companies to be involved, and these large contractors, you know, typically more involved in the defense and aerospace world, you know, joining the space race. And I think that's pretty clearly seen in terms of how heavily the government and especially the military was involved in that era. And it's why you know, despite the fact that we had technology that sent, you know, human beings to the moon and back multiple times, it's why those accomplishments kind of languished for years, because the incentive for going for space was not because there was a marketplace that other people aside from the government were seeking and thought was achievable. And so that's the biggest difference I've seen, is now today, in a way that, you know, other people maybe weren't seeking before, there's individuals and entities beyond the government that are creating a marketplace more organically. And the government still has a very, very heavy hand in today's marketplace, as we've mentioned previously. So it's not to say that it's wholly different, but the increase of this marketplace as a place of kind of doing business and having opportunities and people taking risks beyond just what the government and military are willing to fund, that that's where you see innovation. That's where you see a broader market creation that then, kind of draws in a more powerful industry and a more sustainable industry that grows beyond just what that individual government was seeking to accomplish. I think, that's probably the biggest difference I would see between that era and today's. And I think you can point to it pretty quantitatively in just the source of capital. I mean, today, yes, there's still billions of dollars in national security launch contracts and billions of dollars in NASA contracts for exploration missions and, new vehicles to fly astronauts, et cetera. However, there's also billions of dollars in private capital and new investment coming in. And even now, slowly, beyond just the kind of satellite and telecom world, more even public market capital being invested and people buying into, companies like Virgin Galactic and Maxar Technologies and Iridium Communications, right? So you have this market interest that sees has an incentive that goes beyond just what the government's doing in space, which is what I would characterize as the sole incentive of that prior era.
Thank you for that overview. And that's really amazing. And I guess it gets to the crux of it is the fundamental commercialization versus the government and national use. And when with that, we've got amazing personalities as part of this. And you've had the opportunity to interact with some of them. And without telling too many tales, perhaps, maybe you can give us a little flavor of what you've learned about the leadership in the industry, both at the new kids on the block, the traditional bigs, and part of the startups. Are there commonalities? Are there interesting quirks that you found in these individuals in your experience, or would you liken them to other kind of tech startups or typical executives, or is there a difference? How do you feel?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think the one thing that might help people understand, what it's like to report on a company is that I always try to keep this in mind as a reporter, is that a company is simply an organization of people, represented by a broader masthead underneath, a brand or a logo or whatever, right? And so at the core of it, when we talk about company and we talk about, payrolls and investment and et cetera, what you're really talking about in the core of it is always the human capital in terms of the human beings that make up that actual existence. So with any, thing, if you think about, take, for example, your local sports league, right? For Little League baseball, right? You are going to have different kind of characters. You're going to have, parent coaches and, umpires and kids who are better and kids who are, not as talented or but work hard, right? So you have that whole spectrum of humanity in like this little ecosystem, right? And that's what I try to help people understand with any company is that, different companies have different individuals who have different personalities. I mean, it's really interesting to be able to sit down with so many CEOs and so many vice presidents, but then also sit down with engineers and the people, who are on the factory floors of so many of these different companies, because you understand the whole breadth and a greater expansion of knowledge of who that company is. So, there are your kind of like leaner startups that are trying to really drive down costs. This is top of mind because they just reached space for the first time. But, I remember back to right when this pandemic was beginning, talking to Astra CEO Chris Kemp about their philosophy and their approach to trying to do things for as low cost as possible and the risks that come with that, and kind of this more, leaner, meaner startup sort of mentality. And then, also talking to people who are in the, spacecraft debris removal era. I mean, I had a wonderful conversation with Astroscale's CEO, Nobu Okada, kind of really understanding how you could make money and try to provide new services for debris mitigation and debris removal in space, right? So, and how they're doing it in this really international way and reaching out not just in Japan, but also in the United States and in other countries. And then you have, companies that have this, new niche and are kind of trying to bring a new way of thinking about things. One of my favorite examples in that regards is the Finnish satellite imagery startup ICEYE. Those guys are really bringing this new way of thinking about, how you collect this special type of satellite imagery using a very compact form factor, and is it possible to do it in this kind of more in this kind of efficient and compact form? So I think that kind of maybe helps give people an idea of the businesses that I interact with on like a day-to-day basis. But then at the end of it, we have the businesses that are in the headlines more consistently. You have SpaceX and the fact that Elon Musk's willingness to interact with pretty much anybody via social media adds just a really different dynamic compared to, how Lockheed Martin's vice presidents, interact with reporters, or, Boeing makes announcements in regards to their spacecraft programs, or even, the differences between SpaceX, which has, its stake controlled by a billionaire in Elon Musk, and Blue Origin, which also is owned and controlled by another billionaire, Jeff Bezos, and how those companies have similar but different philosophies and ways of doing things, and yet are, doing things successfully each in their own right. I mean, one thing that I think a lot of people might forget about is, Blue Origin's B-4 rocket engine program won a huge contract to supply the engines for the United Launch Alliance's new rocket Vulcan. And that was, a win against Aerojet Rocketdyne, which has decades and decades of experience in rocket propulsion. And so, these guys being able to think of outside the box and bring new methods of innovation and creating new technologies, it all comes down to the people who are behind the wheel and how they think about things. And it's just as vibrant and different as the people that you interact with in any part of our world today.
It's amazing. And it's really interesting to think about the normalization that represents. That it's not just a wild and crazy. There is still a bit of a Wild West feel, though, and I hope we don't lose it in some ways, because it's certainly making it fun, I think. But at the same time,
right. No, just to briefly add on that, Z,
yes, of course.
I want to say, that like there is still this kind of like Wild West of what can you do in space and what is even allowed to be done, and what's even possible, right? And so that's not been lost, I don't think, because there's still entrepreneurs, but they now come in kind of all flavors. And I just had a great conversation with the CEO of Astrobotic, John Thornton, based in Pittsburgh, building this robot, building multiple spacecraft, actually, not just one, lunar landers that are going to carry payloads to the moon. First one launching late next year, the Peregrine lunar lander. And those guys it's a company that instead of going and, being founded by a billionaire or going and raising venture capital or even, finding other sources of capital, all those obviously are great and find ways to approach business. Those guys got a little bit of seed money at the beginning and then kind of went contract to contract and built themselves up, and then now have been able to win, several major NASA contracts to provide services for a collection of other technologies and research. And so like that, the fact that kind of thinking can succeed in the industry and thrive is amazing, because then you're so right about the fact that it's not just like a Wild West of space. The space race is as varied and different as any other industry you can imagine in terms of the private side and the companies that are involved.
Now, we're getting to the bottom of our hour, and I just want to thank you again for your willingness to take this time with us. I want to kind of ask you a couple of questions that are related to close up our session. And we're going to hope that you join us again in the future, not too long, because I think what's going to be really interesting is to watch and keep putting into context what happens, in Q1 of 2021, and then look at it through the lens of Q3 2021 when things could be so different. But what do you see as the next things that are really exciting? And not just necessarily perhaps what we get a sense of look on the outside looking in, but perhaps from your sense, what people you're talking to in the industry are most excited about. I mean, is it space insurance of all things, which me and only like 3 other people I've ever talked to are thinking about it. But how do you ensure? We worry about questions like how do you ensure an asteroid recovery mission, right? Are people what might we be missing that people are interested in or talking about in the industry that you might be able to shed light on for our audience?
That's a great question. And as a small aside, one of my favorite stories I wrote earlier this year, I ended up talking to multiple, space insurance brokers because there was a kind of a little bit of a back and forth about which is the cheapest heavy lift launch rocket to insure, and whether or not that was the SpaceX Falcon 9 or the Arianespace Vega or the ULA Atlas V, right? So like just in that world, it's such a fascinating piece of the greater puzzle, because insurance is something that you need for so many different parts of your daily life, right? Car insurance, home insurance, right? But then we're talking about it for hundreds of millions of dollars of a very fragile payload that's being flung at thousands of miles an hour into space. And how do you write a policy around something like that? But so just to your point, space insurance can actually be exciting and interesting. But I'd say that the thing that maybe people are missing, because the thing they aren't missing is the importance and the significance of the multiple different human spaceflight services that are either nearing, completion, whether that's Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, or Boeing Starliner, or SpaceX's Crew Dragon, now having flown, launched twice, landed once, about to land in a couple months again, and going to continue operating, more consistently moving forward. People aren't missing that. People understand and recognize how significant that is to now be flying multiple people a year, as opposed to just only a handful, into kind of spare seats that the Russians we have to pay for to fly with the Russians. I'd say that the thing that people pretty consistently miss is why the kind of growth of deal making in the industry is significant. When you see folks like Relativity going out and raising that kind of capital, and especially from the investors that they did, a broad variety of investors who've got very, very incredible track records in terms of their history beyond space. You've got deals like that. You've got these companies that are looking to go public, actually through either SPACs or even maybe possibly traditional IPOs. When you look at the deal making side of the market, whether it's consolidation or acquisitions such as, Lockheed Martin, looking to buy Aerojet Rocketdyne. All of those are huge, huge pieces of information. And I think people miss oftentimes the significance behind any sort of deal making, because what deal making for the space industry means is this kind of broader acceptance of people beyond just the space geeks like you and me, recognizing that there is value in what these companies are doing, and that they are seeking to create and add more value, because an investor puts money in because they think that money is going to grow and that whatever they're investing in is going to be able to use that money to then create more value, right? And so that's, I think, something that gets missed very often. And I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of deals happen in 2021 with already some momentum in 2020, even despite a global pandemic that, threatened at several moments to really stifle and freeze the industry in its tracks and a lot of the progress that have been made in the last decade. So I think what happens in 2021 on the deal making side is probably probably the thing I would point out, is like, don't miss the significance of what those represent, what acquisitions and consolidations and people coming to the public markets, what that represents.
Thank you for that. That's a true insight, I believe, is watch the deal making. And you bring up a really great point, is that those were not just tech investors and kind of family speculators who are taking a flyer that invested in Relativity. That was a $500 million round, and an investor expects at least a 10x return within nominally 5 years of value. That's the old math that one talks about. So that means that they're assuming that money, that 500 million, is going to turn into 5 billion. That's a heck of a statement, and the valuation that gives Relativity. Well, people should read your article on it, I suppose.
I would hope they did. Yeah, no, I would hope they did. I was really, honored to sit down with CEO Tim Ellis and then, pick his brain about what that really meant and what they were trying to do. And I think one of the biggest things that was fascinating that he told me, in our exclusive for CNBC was that, that they still had the majority of their capital from the prior raise. So it wasn't, and any analyst and even just simple smart wealth advisor will tell you raise money when you can, not when you need to. And so they really are capitalizing on that opportunity to go raise money when they could and when there was demand. And so it'll be really interesting to follow both their arc, but then also, we talked quite a bit about Relativity here, but there are a cadre of companies. If you go down the list of the top 20 companies underneath, SpaceX and Relativity, are all these different companies that, some of them could become new public stocks, just like Virgin Galactic did last year. And right. So that's something that people are going to be interested in and should be paying attention to. Or if right. you look at that top 20, top 25 list in terms of value and who's the farthest along in development, like who's kind of going to take that next step, and as investors call it, get the exit into the public market.
Right. I mean, and then that could be some of the excitement of 2021 is, as launch has basically been commoditized as of the end of 2020. What non-launch companies should we be looking at? Do you have anybody that you're particularly interested in following, given your recent reporting? I know I'm putting you on the spot there to name names, but not stock pick, but just somebody who's doing really interesting things outside of launch. Is that an area where you see the chronicling and the journalism set for expansion?
Yeah, no. So I would call out more subsectors than individual company names.
Sure, that makes sense.
I think geospatial imagery is a sector that's had a pretty steady growth path and has several companies kind of competing on a high level. The data analytics side of things, I think, is hugely important to space and not talked about often enough in terms of companies that offer space-specific, data analysis. The third piece of it, I would say, is you got this new generation of communication constellations in SpaceX's Starlink, and now OneWeb's back out of Chapter 11 and launching again. And you have even other people taking different kind of approaches to space communications and beyond just kind of broadband, right? Internet of Things connectivity and stuff like that, right? So there's more broadly like satellite communications, I'd say, is a sector that people really got to keep an eye on. I mean, there's so much excitement I've seen already from what Starlink kind of initially offers in this private beta, public beta that's going on.
And so that's like a phoenix coming out of the ashes, right? I mean, I didn't see that coming. That was remarkable to me. They'd closed doors and then suddenly, holy cow.
Yeah, quite remarkable. And then I'd say the kind of the fourth and final piece of all this, and maybe it's not a subsector per se, but just space services more broadly. And I think a great example of this is the Bishop airlock that was just installed on the International Space Station by NanoRacks. That's a piece of hardware that's been attached to the space station that, as far as I'm aware, the only other piece of hardware that's significant attached to the exterior of the space station is the Bigelow Aerospace beam module that's still up there. But the NanoRacks, funded that project themselves. They will operate that project themselves. It's a place to conduct science. It's a new piece of access on the space station itself. And so that's hugely significant, because then you look towards what people are trying to do with commercial modules of either separate private space stations or new attachments to the space station, the International Space Station. So you've got Axiom Space, really moving the ball forward on trying to not just do the kind of their services and logistics of flying astronauts, which they have that mission coming up next year, but I think more significantly, they're moved toward the goal of attaching a new module to the space station, building their own private space stations. NanoRacks has that similar goal. I even talked to Sierra Nevada Corporation. They're kind of one of the mid-range defense contractors in terms of size, but they've got quite a significant space unit, and one piece of that is this habitable, expanding space station technology that they've been working on. And so stuff like that is all really fascinating. So I'd say the fourth piece that I would really watch is that kind of space services and logistics, if you will.
All right. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you on, Michael, because the perspective that you can offer is just remarkable, given everything that's going on. And folks, you heard it here. Look for the deal making, look for acquisitions, look for investments, look for IPOs next year, and also look at the sectors that were just described. Analytics, geospatial, and a couple others for what's going to be exciting outside of launch. Launch is going to continue to be amazing, and companies are rapidly turning launch into a competitive enterprise. It'll be fun. Who's going to be the BJ Hunt of space? So it'll be really exciting to look at that. Thanks so much, Michael, for having and taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely, Z. Thank you, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
All right. Cheers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be having future episodes of America's Future Series Space Talks with Michael for sure, to help provide context and put things into perspective. Everyone, take care. Cheers.